think this is the last session before we're going all back to the general space. But I think it's a very exciting topic. My name is Marleen Stikker. I'm founder, director of Waag and board member of PublicSpaces. And we're going to talk about radical different infrastructures and mesh networks. And I just asked, do we have presentations? Because sometimes a visual can explain, but these people are experts and they're going to explain it to us, what they're actually working on and how it functions. I came on this, the story of mesh networks because of the Fab Labs that we have, and some people were sort of making something nice, and I was like, what are you doing? Well, radio, LoRa, mesh statics, all stuff that's already there for a long time, but now combined, some people are building an independent infrastructure without, so if something, a blackout is there, like energy grids or satellites or whatever, we still can communicate. And then I feel like, yes, this is the idea of being independent, that we have the knowledge. And it's a low tech solution, like low stacks, maybe if we can think of it, which is also a very nice idea about the idea that we're going to solve all problems with AI. It's only contributing to some of the problems in the world. And then with mesh networks, we might have some, well, low-tech solutions for some of the very critical questions we have if it's about strategic autonomy and geopolitical powers that be. So who do we have here? Radical Data, the two of you. You have, and I've thought the description is really great. It's data, art, and activism, repurposing tech for liberation and joy. It's very important. It's also about joy. We are a studio, an educational platform, and a community. Rayén Mitrovic and Jo Kruse. Together you are the radical data, not the critical, the radical data. Yes.
We're part of it.
You're part of it. Yeah, it's a bigger organization. That's yes. And I will give you the floor in a moment to explain a bit more what you're doing. And then here we have Maxigas. You are a co-principal investigator. Yes. Oh, you took off your hat.
Back on
oh, the hat goes on again. Okay.
Procedure.
So like, you're welcome. You're a principal investigator of the Critical Infrastructure Lab here at the University of Amsterdam. Very happy that this Critical Infrastructure Lab is in existence, and great that you're here. And you're also an assistant professor from computational methods on the University of Utrecht. And you're working on a project Reticulum. So you will also going to explain what that is. But can I first ask one of you, or both of you, to explain your project with mesh networks?
Sure.
Yeah. Should we explain a little bit about radical data first, or
do both. Away? Yeah. So radical data, and then why are you doing this, and what is it what you're actually doing?
We are doing too much, maybe. Well, me and Jo are the co-founders of Radical Data. As we said, we are a bigger collective. We work with different organizations and different people. I think the root of our work is based on co-creation. It's working with communities and people who are usually not invited to discuss and create technology and dream about the role of technology in our world. So we work with them very much across the globe. We are based in the Netherlands, but we spent probably half of the year somewhere else because we found really important to work along with the Global South, especially when we are thinking about futures. We don't want to be North and Western center as many centuries have been. So I am from Chile, from Latin America. Joe's from the north of England, and we both try to create a network. We call it also sometimes the Radical Data Movement. So we run different projects of education, community. We create tools. We write utopias and different things. Do you want to?
And in terms of this project, we really started on this after the internet went off in Gaza. That was really the starting point. And we were seeing stories come out of people who wanted to say goodbye to their families, who couldn't, their families might be just a kilometer away or something, but because of the infrastructure we have, the internet was off, they couldn't say that. And we thought it was heartbreaking and also kind of a bit absurd that we couldn't send messages to each other further than shouting in that instance, So that started a process of us thinking, okay, what would it look like to make sure that that wouldn't be possible again. And also then led to questions of, why are we in a situation right now where that is possible? What has happened to our infrastructure right now so that it can be turned off? And this started our work on mesh, which we've been very interested in, more resilient communication networks. And I think it came from thinking very much about disaster, but I think it's also become a question of the infrastructure of every day that we also live with here in the Netherlands. So I think it'd be great if we can talk about those parts of this as well today.
Yeah.
And maybe for people that have, because how many people are familiar with mesh? Oh, wow, that's really nice.
Wow.
More than I was
Very
expecting.
meshy audience.
But for the ones that are not, because we want to be all included in the discussion, could you explain a little bit more about what mesh networks are and how they function?
Yeah, so a normal, most communication networks we have are centralized at some level. You know, we go from smaller outer bits to collecting a bunch in our routers here, and then that goes to a building down the road and collects a bunch of buildings, and everything gets more and more centralized. A mesh network is a general way of connecting things where things in general connect to each other before going, or instead of going fully centralized. So instead of, if I wanted to text Marleen, instead of it going through the whole digital infrastructure system, going through some servers and coming back and going to Marleen, a mesh network might just send it direct to Marleen. And the idea is, if there's someone who Marleen is able to connect with a little bit further away, like over there, but my network doesn't stretch over there, it can be routed. So my message goes first to Marleen and then to you guys over there. So
it's quite interesting because the TCP/IP protocol of the internet is like it has some similarities. It's also different because of the TCP/IP itself became very much centralized again. So it's sort of like trying to get back some of these principles.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
And someone who spoke to us at the booth today had a brilliant point. I don't know if they're here, but I'm going to steal it. But they said, you know, the ideas we were talking about were really bringing the internet back to what it was maybe in the 90s with this real intention of decentralization.
Yeah, and distribution. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Could you explain your project? Because you're also in this, well, like with the Critical Infrastructure Lab, this is one of the questions that you raise and study every day about how these infrastructures are already being politicized and already directing power and so on. Could you explain a bit how you stepped into this field and what your project is about?
Yeah, so the Critical Infrastructure Lab is for... Hello? All right, so we are properly networked. The Critical Infrastructure Lab is for exploring infrastructural futures that center people and planet over profit and capital. And we have 3 research lines. Environment, spearheaded by Fike Jansen. Geopolitics, directed by Niels ten Oever. And Maxigas, myself. I am the leader of the track on industrial standards. So in this capacity, I actually study exactly the opposite of mesh networks, which are the new generation telecommunications networks, mobile phone networks, and 5G networks. So how I got interested in Reticulum was exactly because I saw a lot of problems with 5G networks. Of course, the motivation to look at what is the telecommunications networks that run on our phones today came already from the fact that during the pandemic, a lot of people put fire to the telecommunications masts, to the mobile phone antennas. And well, there are a few things that I like in life, but one of them is fire on the street, and another one is routers, and when I see network equipment on fire.
Beautiful life you have.
I thought this is something worth to look into. And in more wider terms, it was really true that there was a group of people who actually didn't believe in progress anymore, who didn't accept this idea that just because it's new, it's better, and you got to have it. And I thought that actually that was a very powerful gesture, because even if they were wrong about, for instance, the health concerns about the antennas, they were right about something much more important and much more significant. They were questioning the underlying logic of modernity that is alienating us from our everyday life, but specifically from our relations. And that's why I thought to look into how 5G networks actually distribute not just messages, but also power, and how they could be different. And the biggest contrast I could find between communication protocols was between 5G networks and the Reticulum protocol that I'm kind of occupied with a lot of other people who actually know much more about it than me.
And so that tells how you got there, like the biggest contrast that you could find. And how would you describe this contrast? Like how radical, in the term? Maybe you can also explain the name of the project.
So Reticulum just means roots, and of course that has a lot of baggage from metaphors of networks, rhizomes that grow under the ground. But more importantly, Reticulum is not coming from a commercial motivation. Actually, it's coming from an anti-commercial motivation. So it is one of the few network protocols that is not backed by a startup company, that is not backed up by subsidies, and where actually the new license explicitly says that the protocol should not be used in any system that can intentionally cause harm to humans, or it cannot also be used in any system that is used to train or help in any way the development of artificial intelligence. So it is a protocol developed for humans and against the artificial intelligences.
It's quite an interesting license, actually. We should maybe that could be applied to many other technologies.
Well, the new license makes it.
What is the name of this license?
It is called the Reticulum license.
Okay. So okay, you can search for that. Yes.
This is where the problem begins, because it means that it is still an open question how compatible this license is with other licenses, because one of the most important functions of a license is that it tells you what kind of software you can combine with what other software. So if you write your own license, you kind of isolate yourself from other licensors, other software creators. And now there is a big discussion, but it is also supposed to be legally unenforceable, most probably. So it is more like a gesture, on the one hand, to express what are the values behind this protocol and what is the intention. And of course, that is already a very important starting point. But in practical terms, even if it is legally unenforceable somehow, it is making it hard to incorporate into bigger corporate systems where the legal uncertainty is actually a big issue. And I guess that protects the protocol from what I call recuperation, where people start out by trying to find a technological solution to our social problems, the machine that will build the revolution, and through, of course, then this happens always in some kind of dependency with the industries. So even if we talk about protocols that don't need a mobile phone but can run on very simple microcontrollers, we have to know how to get those microcontrollers, and most people's first thoughts would be to order them from Shenzhen. And that is not really, even if we are talking about relatively simple technology, that is not really an independent supply chain where you feel like you're in control of your own technology.
Yes.
So I guess that beyond the protocol, it's also important how people implement this protocol, how it is deployed on the ground. And if we look at it from the other side, not from the point of view of protocol design, but from the point of view of deployment, I guess that's important to work, of course, in Hacker, where we always say we try to work with off-the-shelf components, right? But an interesting question to ask is, where are those shelves? And the other developments around this protocol are also about mapping the smart cities. So that's when we talk about scavenging in the ruins of the smart city, because we think it's all already a big trash pile what we have on the street in terms of digital infrastructures. And for instance, trying to find out where we can find the devices and where we can take devices
them
from to repurpose them to run a network.
Great. Yes. I think it's quite interesting because you have this, like, it's non-military use, or only it is very specific, where you also see that the mesh networks and also the LoRa mesh statics are also being used actually by military forces as a backup for if other systems are down. So it's quite interesting that also this very low-tech networks, or these ideas about it, are already sometimes being used in specific areas already. I think, how would you consider? Do you feel it as a problem, or is it one of the things that makes it, even if you think about defense or war and whole of society? I feel that to have this kind of technologies in your own hands as a society helps to be more resilient. On the other hand, it is already part of more like the larger military construct. So I think I'm very confused by it. Let's say, do you understand? Do you have the same confusion, or do you think it's solvable?
Yeah, it's one of the. I think the project where I've been most worried about open sourcing anything to do with it, because of how much people turn radio technologies into stuff that will be used in military contexts. So I totally feel that at some level. Another level, the military is using this already, and I think if Reticulum got useful enough to be useful to the military, they wouldn't have a problem with using that for whatever they wanted. So it's a difficult one. I think my instinct, I don't know about you actually on this, but my instinct is more to, there's a lot of tools already out there, like you said, this off-the-shelf idea, and no one's really put them together in a way that we can use as any group of people to communicate in very adversarial conditions.
I just want to show you this one. This is our efforts to put it into a little box. And there, of course, you have the same question, like, do you make it with a fab lab? You can really do all the manufacturing yourself, also the hardware and the wire and stuff. But of course, there's a lot of the shelf already coming from China, open source even. It was quite confusing. But then, so we put this a few weeks ago, inclusive, like how to make it and how to, and then people started to come to us and say, like, okay, can I buy one? Can I get one? And then, of course, it is not good enough yet. It's not a consumer product. It's really an environment where you have to hack your way through all this, and people need a lot of understanding of all this to participate in it. So it's almost also an educational process where you have to put people in understanding networks. Or what I think what friends of mine living in Spain, they had this like blackout, and then the only way that they could get information was with a radio, and they were like, "Wow, what a technology! Radio, well,
Yeah.
totally rediscovered the whole essence of radio." It was quite funny that we sometimes totally forget because we rely on satellite and all that kind of stuff. So it's also quite an interesting way to get people into a like really understanding what surrounds them and what makes them communicate and how depending they are. So is it in your practice that, because you say we are this community, we're building this kind of settings also with co-creation, do you feel that this is also a way to get people in this process, in understanding how technology works, like in the demystification also of technology?
Yeah, I think it's really important, you know, the kind of, we always say with Jo, when we work with people, that like most of the process of creating technology is not writing code and is not being a technical person. And because I think something we realize a lot in our work is, and I think in general, you can see that most people is really kind of, there is this, this big gap, you know, of like one side is there's like fear of technology and like how this is something that is so complex and so difficult and so technical and just very smart people can do it. And the other side is this kind of paralyzation, right? Like people really, in the conversations you have, you know, probably, I don't know how it's in this room, but with neighbors or family or your mom, it's really this feeling of like, no, I'm not, you know, I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a technical person. So most of the work we do is to kind of work with people who is not technical and bring this idea to practice of like how relevant is the discussions around which kind of technologies are we engaging with, which kind of technologies are we building, what are the ethics behind them, what is the functionality of them, and what is the need for them. I think that's also super central for us and in what we encounter in our work, and also what you, Maxigas, were saying about like how there's in this notion of progress, there is this idea of like, just because it's coming out, I need to engage, but I don't even know if I need that or if it's part of my context even. And then there is this kind of time relation, you know, where, as you were saying, when there's a blackout in Spain and Portugal, where people kind of came back to, you know, for 24 hours to the kind of the candles and the radio, and there is also a bit of this kind of romanticization of the past. But I think the very interesting question we have right now is like, how do we learn and how do we kind of decompose like the parts that are bringing it to now and put them together in a different way that are more related with the ethics and the needs that we are thinking and the people actually need. And then for me, there's also the question of the name of this panel, you know, is like, how do we communicate when disaster strikes? Is also what are the needs for the people in the world. Is not the need of the people in the West. So it's really important for me, and also maybe interesting to discuss today, when we are thinking about alternative infrastructure and communication, all these kind of things, who are we having in mind when we are designing this, and from where, and what are the needs are we designing for? Because yeah, I'm interested in that conversation, because I think as a person from the Global South, I see a lot in the world of speculative design, how the dystopia of these crises and end of the world in Europe is actually things that are happening in loads of places, or have happened for many years in loads of other places. So I think we are very interested on dismantling this dystopia idea that we have right now, that is quite everywhere, and also with our mom and neighbor, that it's like a fear of actually like a white person in the West, you know, is that it's a fear of not a singular, say, I'm saying like a kind of archetype, you know, it's a fear of a certain specific subconscious, you know, in the world with a specific history. So I'm very interested on how to dismantle that dystopia and how that fear has to be like breaking down, you know, because there is a lot of experiences further away that have a lot of creativity, resilience, and resistance that we can learn from each other of.
It's quite an interesting thing you're proposing, because Jo, you just said like one of the moments that you start to realize how important that we are so depending on these larger structures and infrastructures is in Gaza, for example, where the central communication is being shut down, and then you only can shout. If we don't even know how to do this with the fire stuff again, so like the Morse signs. So we have to sort of rethink that. But these are really, I mean, I think we all feel on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, how terrible the situation is there, and how we feel sort of powerless in changing that situation. But it's clearly that this kind of tech makes sense in that environment. So it's not a dystopian in the future. It's already there.
Exactly.
And in Ukraine, the same situation, and the borders of Europe, it's the same situation that some people have to rely on this kind of technologies, because otherwise they will be mapped or will be identified. And a lot of the drones will work not on the 5G stuff, because I think it's not just a dystopian in the future. It feels very, very, very close. So this idea like when. So I understand, but I also understand when you say that we don't only have to build it up on top of this idea of dystopian futures. We can also see it as a way for creativity. But I think I try to figure out solidarity. Yeah. So I'm just trying to figure out if this idea that we only are involved in it because of the fear for our own wealth and situation, or that it is definitely also something which is based on solidarity already.
Yeah.
Could you refer to, or maybe you want to?
You were kind of making this point also right in the beginning that apart from imagining disaster, in a lot of ways we already live in a disaster, and especially if you care about communication protocols, it's quite clear that it's a disaster of layers of abstraction on the top of layers of abstraction that actually nobody understands, even the engineers who are running it. So yeah, I wanted you to make that argument, how you think it is this kind of work is relevant apart from the emergency infrastructure scenario.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice point. I think, we were drawn to this from the point of disaster, and
urgency,
genocide. Yeah. Okay, real people dying and heartbreaking stories. But like you say, it revealed a much more systemic issue. I think the more we've gone into it, and these crises of the last few years, for some reason, there's a bit of a clusterfuck of things that are happening right now that are making us realize, okay, our digital infrastructure is pretty fucked. If we started from this idea of a internet as, inherently decentralized, inherently open, the IP protocol is like the internet protocol, the thing that gives the internet its name, is amazing. It was designed way back and it works on your smart fridge. That's a cool protocol, and over the last 20 years, we kind of maybe fell asleep a little bit, and we let digital infrastructure become more centralized. We let states take part ownership. We let internet service providers take a bigger role. It became centralized. And I think crises are horrible, but they make you realize what is wrong with the day-to-day. And I think when Musk says he's not going to turn on Starlink for Ukraine, when Israel turns off the internet for Gaza, you realize, okay, there's something off here, right? Something went wrong with this vision of the internet we had. And I think the thing that excites me, and I think a lot of people around mesh networks, is this idea of returning to some other vision that we originally had of the internet, of connecting anyone whenever. And that has been revealed to be kind of a bit of a lie the last few years, and we kind of let it slip. And so the question now is like, okay, what do we do about that?
I just want to, because I saw that many people are here knowing about mesh networks, or maybe already working with it. Can I identify you? Identify yourself, yes. No, could I ask you, like, what is the reason that you started to work with it? Is there a reason that you thought, is it this disaster that strikes, or is it something else that is intriguing for you?
Well, for me, the question is, when does it make sense to use it right now? So how can mesh networks also make a good world better?
Yeah.
Because then it escapes from this curiosity device that is on the shelf that you'll use and play with for a week or so, but don't know how to operate anymore when disaster strikes. So what sense does it make to improve our lives every day, here and now, without having to consider gas, etc.?
Yeah.
The joy part. Tell us the joy part.
Yeah, but also something that you were saying from the beginning is about like the practical side of it, right?
I think
How do we...
it's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
I think part of it, a lot of the knowledge around this is in like prepper forums. Like if you go into like things that
Is
people who are,
anybody here prepping? Anybody?
I think so.
Also, I thought this little one should be next to the biscuits and the batteries.
Yeah, but if you go into these forums, there's a real deep technical knowledge of mesh networks. And so a lot of the research we did was in these forums. And even when there are these disasters in the world right now, they were still just talking about their shelters. Honestly, it was wild. From a very pragmatic point of view, even if you're just interested in disaster to yourself, I think you need to be comfortable with these tools. You need your mum to have one. You need your neighbor to have one. At the moment, it's like 50 random dudes in the Netherlands who send each other ping and they get back pong, you know? It's like, it's not...
They're also gals, huh? Just saying.
It's not the level that we need for if there was a disaster. There were people in Spain and Portugal with Meshtastic, for sure. But the thing they used was a bunch of amateur radio enthusiasts started sharing national news. They set up radios in the plazas. You know, that was the actual infrastructure that came up in disaster, not this thing that we're talking about of this kind of speculative disaster that might one day come. We kind of need to build a resilience into our daily lives at some level. So I think part of it is if you are interested in your own apocalypse, it's good to prepare before, in the sense of having something you use that you will then use in disaster as well. But I think there's also a question that it brings up of, okay, if the internet can be turned off, there's something a bit wrong with that, and it reveals things that we live with every day. You know, we get surveilled. That's not good for any of us here. You know, the real questions of like liberty at stake with the current form of the internet that I think mesh networks might not be the whole answer for, but they gesture towards another way of organizing the internet. But I can see.
Yes, I want to say,
joyful.
because yes, I think what you try to ask for is like, okay, within this context of disaster, preparing for it. Okay, but is there another reason why we could engage with it?
Sure.
Outside of disaster and more for joyful, because then people would maybe already use it, and we might have better user interfaces than what we have right now, because it's really nerdy.
Nice.
Really nerdy. So we nobody really stepped into making it like a very nice design of it, or a very like creative thing. So
I think there's something interesting here that's, in general, we think of digital and we think of universal public data, like it's the same experience for everyone. I think something that mesh networks or more local digital infrastructure bring up is the idea that you can have things that where physical space still matters, where being present at a specific time still matters. So you could have a show, for example, music concert, which is only available within Amsterdam because we're sharing it on our mesh network here. And you have to be in Amsterdam somewhere to do it. There might be a TV show that's released only in Rotterdam or something, and you have to be there for it. There might be, as there is today, a mesh network running here that you can collaborate on documents, and the internet can't see that at all. You know, the possibilities
might be interesting then for festivals to have like a layer of festivals which then helps people to understand how it works and start to engage with it. Okay.
Yeah, and it makes
Another joyful idea.
No, I think it makes an interesting relationship between local and global. You know, also brings. We were in the conversations we were having in the bazaar was this question around like the physical and the digital, the embodiment and the collectivity and all these kind of things, and how we can create tools that in a way can also play a little bit with that. So like, for example, now the mesh that we kind of prototype for today is something that is running in that floor, in these buildings, you know, so people who is coming here and maybe a little bit outside of the walls, but like how we can make also encounters that create little bubbles that are secure and that they are local and they can share some information. Maybe they can run an AI because they want to, I don't know, figure out something, I don't know. But I think the idea, I think something we bring a lot with our work and our experience and my personal experience as well from Latin America is a whole way of like understanding activism from a quite joyful way. You know, I think something when I'm saying about this dystopia thing is because I see it, you know, when I came to Europe for the first time, I was saying the other day, I encountered for the first time the sad activist, you know, like this kind of sadness, you know, and like seriousness that is behind, like, in my experience, in a lot of like the activism in Western Europe, you know, and I found it quite strange, you know, because it's like, okay, guys, you are not suffering that much, but why are you so sad, you know, like, and then something that comes from my personal history and the culture that I share with a big continent is a celebration of life, you know, it's a culture of life. So that means that even when you are like experiencing really hard oppression, there is also always time for dancing and for jokes and for sharing meals. But that doesn't mean there's not a binary, you know, it's things that are entangled together, you know. So building a mesh network that is maybe for something quite hard happening right now in Gaza and maybe for other places, but that doesn't mean also Palestine, you know, is a culture of life and celebration and dance and joy. And that's why it's also so horrible what's happening today. So I think building these alternatives and using them in a day by day, it's part of also that culture of life, which I think is so important to kind of discuss in the politics and the activisms of these crises as tools, you know.
I think because the idea about a celebration as something, and I think this is also what you put into your description of your organization of joy and celebration. It's quite an interesting say to design from this perspective of celebration and not from disaster. It's kind could you work with that as well? Do you think what you're working on could be would that help you to further develop it, this notion of celebration?
Yeah, and I think...
Or maybe also to you, sorry, to Maxigas.
No, Maxigas, I'd like to
Maxigas, sorry. Yeah. I want to hear something of Maxigas. Yes.
No, but feel free to continue.
I'll listen to you and then see if I feel like talking.
Well, yeah, now in the lab, one of the things we discuss is what we call the first rule of Maxigas.
The first rule, yes. How many rules do you have?
Yeah.
So far, only one.
So it could just be the rule.
Which is that the infrastructure can bring people together only as long as it doesn't work. So it's kind of...
Wow.
Repeat.
The infrastructure can bring people together only as long as it doesn't work.
It's like a Buddhist koan.
Yeah.
Wow.
We are doing these smart batteries, but with the Reticulum network, it is the same, that we only meet in person as a kind of, let's say, an embodied community to tinker with it, as long as we didn't solve this problem that you described. And as soon as we solve that problem, it becomes the facilitator of making other things happen. But basically, we lose the network and we lose the human connections that building the network built. And in that moment, the people who build that network will be probably working on a different protocol. Because actually there are people for whom joy means looking at network packets in a capture. Or looking at a spectrum analyzer and trying
a huge
to
celebration,
the
looking
shape
at
of a
packet
network.
switching, yeah?
Pure joy.
And I don't think that even for a resilient, organic, even for an anarcho-communist society, it is really important that everybody can decrypt a network packet from a radio capture. But I do think that it's important to have people, like you mentioned, the ham radio operators, who actually can deal with this technology, and for this kind of knowledge to be available, but also for this kind of hardware to be available. And this is why the radio is, the analog FM radio is still the disaster communication device of the people, because the Tetra communication has been proprietary. It's been reverse engineered 2 years ago, I believe. But it is not something that is in the hands of the people. And this is why it is actually really important to democratize even 5G networks today, because as you say, in the Netherlands, the deployment of mesh networks is a kind of joke. If you want to, if we can compare it to the defense line of Amsterdam, that was like really built out, but didn't really defend Amsterdam so much. So the telecommunications networks, they are really well deployed in the Netherlands. And if they would be turned off and people would know how to operate them, how to use these radios, that would actually mean much more than if we know how to play with the microcontrollers and so on. But yeah, as I say, as you said already, it is a kind of prefigurative practice in the sense, and I think that also tells something about this moment, this historical moment, why mesh networks came up again. Like
again, because it is around for a long time already.
If you see the program of this conference, it sounds like a flashback to the 90s when people thought that we will build our own internet, that you also mentioned. And so I'm still convinced that there is this gesture of, we often imagine our whole life, we try to understand life in terms of networks, not just communication networks, but networks in general. And playing with communication networks is a kind of material practice of trying to create different connections. And in a network society, let's say, this is a very powerful way of engaging with power relationship in society, but also in a kind of artisanal way, working on these social relations in terms of physics and mathematics. But what is different from the 1990s mesh networks and the mesh networks movements today is that we are not just imagining our society in terms of networks, but also in terms of the logistical aspect of supply chains. So this is,
say it again, sorry?
We are not just imagining our society in terms of networks,
Yes.
of graphs, but also in terms of the logistical aspects of supply chains. So we consider where are there conflict minerals in the technologies that we are relying on? Do we have to order them from Shenzhen? How much natural resource consumption they have? What kind of administrative institutions we need to build in order to operate something like the domain name system, for instance. It is not just about what kind of connections we want, but also the reverse, what kind of dependencies we want to rely on in our everyday life. And for that, it is a wonderful exercise to engage in these practices, and hopefully it also produces enough literacy so that in the next disaster we can actually dig out the ESP32 microcontrollers from our fridge and hook them up to a little antenna.
That's a good idea, actually. So we're going to do hunting for this kind of technologies in our refrigerators and all the toys that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So probably
I think this,
that we need to communicate with each other in a decentralized way has already been manufactured, and it's already in this city. We just have
To
to
repurpose
connect
it.
them in a different
Yeah.
way.
But I think you also gave an answer to why suddenly everybody's talking about mesh networks, which are around and radio technology as well, is because it's not just about the communication; it's about the dependencies. So we're figuring out that we are in a situation that we are depending on people that we don't like, or structures and infrastructures, and also the consequences of all that we have. So I think that's a quite interesting thing that sort of explains why we're back to this kind of very low-tech solutions. And I just wanted to be sure that are there any questions in the room? Anybody who wants to have a, just to be sure that I'm not forgetting all of you, or anything to add to this story?
There's one there, I think.
Oh, there. Sorry, Michael. Yeah, I come to you.
I just had a small joy to add for mesh networks right now. Like in 2023 in New York, you had like the New York Mesh, and they offered like very cheap internet for low connected neighborhoods. And that's just something you can use right now. So everybody has very cheap access, which is nice. And it goes
and it's working.
It was working, but I think it's been sort of banned. Not 100%.
It's turned off again.
Yeah.
But there are similar examples all around the world as well. So
Yeah.
if we could look at like Latin America, there are amazing projects of like community mesh networks completely disconnected from the internet where people can
It's still
communicate.
running as well,
Yep.
or just as like a situational based thing?
They run.
They
So
run.
there's a really great activist doing a lot in Brazil, but across Latin America, they're just setting these up. There's a Guifi in Catalonia, connects loads of people. Freifunk in Germany's been running for like 20 years, you know. There are amazing stories of communication as a human right at some level, of just providing this free or very cheap to everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the
Anyway, could I
Sorry.
ask maybe also a little bit to wrap up the story? Is that where it's at the moment, and you give some examples that it's actually running, but I think if we would like, if we go for the hunting and trying to get it all sort of repurposed in moments of real disaster, still it will be very difficult for a lot of people to use it because it's it's a very steep entrance point to understand how to put it. Like the devices that we use are still not there. You can buy them off the shelf, by the way, but then you will have to order them from China, basically. Do you think that the community around mesh networks and mesh aesthetics has enough design disciplines in it, or are there enough creative people involved in it? Sometimes I feel that we have a technical solution and then we are missing out on the experience part or the joyful part, especially because you were also referring to that. And what could be like a step towards a more integrated way of dealing with this?
It's a brilliant question. I think one of the core things that the open source movement often misses is like strategists at some level, or people who like have an overview of users and building could, I don't know, it's a mess sometimes. And
A real mesh.
a real messy mesh. Yeah. So I think there's massive space for non-technical people and massive need for them. Even like at the tools we use, you know, like how does a designer contribute to a open source project? We've built Git and GitHub around lines of code. It's very easy for a programmer to commit, bring changes to this, but for a designer and a user experience expert, how do they do that? So there's a real lack of infrastructure, even in the open source movement, I think, that we really need to address. So that's one thing. The other is just on the mesh network side, we don't need devices like that. You can have a mesh network between your phones. So in a lot of the examples we've looked at, when authoritarian governments have shut down the internet in a localized space for a protest, people have used Bluetooth mesh networks between their phones, and they're amazing. And they were actually your startup idea of doing them at festivals. A lot of the tools they were using were like VC-backed Silicon Valley companies who'd made Bluetooth mesh networks for festivals, and they were just repurposing them on the streets of Hong Kong or Bolivia or Iran to communicate during protests.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yes, please, if you could, it is a question of all three of you, so yeah.
Okay, no, I just think it's just a really interesting point, and I don't know for the variety of people that is here, but I think I just want to make a call because I think it's really important to kind of work more intersectionally around worlds and around the spheres. I found, as a person who doesn't come from technology, not the hacker world, not the open source world, quite a violent context, I would call it, like quite hard to enter and quite, well, we know very also like from a very like masculine energy, which I found also quite difficult. And I think sometimes, you know, when we bring these ideas of like open source and opening things, like it's open, sometimes I feel just for the community, but like open to other people involves thinking about if my grandma wants to use this, can she use it, you know? Can my neighbor who is a baker use this, you know? And I feel the need, now that we're speaking, you know, for the people who is here, the relevance of like designers and creatives, but also inviting other people to the spaces to think about how do we build these tools. And we were talking the whole day in the bazaar with people around the mesh. And for me, at the end, the whole conclusion, what is needed is not really like monetary resources or equipment. It's just organization. Like we need to organize. And I think in this country, that is a word that for me feels quite far. Like people doesn't self-organize much, at least what I feel. And it's a much more like individual society. And I think the current situations we are living through, like the crises we are living and the whole, you know, like fascism around Europe demands our organization. And that means knocking the door of your neighbor and saying, hey, I want to run a mesh network, should we talk? Or putting a sign and saying, should we do an assembly with the square, you know, the 5 blocks around or whatever. And that involves putting together the person who writes the code and wants to do open source with a designer, with a teacher, with a baker, with a fireman, you know, because this is the people who is going to use our tools. So, yeah, I just think that intersection is really important.
Thank you. Thank you for the call. And one of the things here is that we are in public spaces are strategizing, collaborating. Because hopefully that will add. But I think I totally agree with you that this intersection is not really happening, not enough.
Yeah.
There's a hackers and designers movement, but then that's really again this is not enough. Yes, and also in education it's not there, not enough. Would you want to respond to that? What do you? Would you think that because your critical infrastructure lab is at the University of Amsterdam, which is a generic university, is already great. But is that a place where you can see that you can collaborate with the other disciplines, or are you seen as something which is very specifically like more technical IT, telecom department? Is it already transdisciplinary?
So in fact, the critical infrastructure lab is in the humanities department.
Yes, that's already one.
So it's always very strange when we work with equipment and we have a lab that actually has machines. And we ask for tens of thousands of euros for equipment, and that they think we will buy a lot of books. But in fact, I study 5G networks inside the university because it needs a lot of money to study them, because they are very complicated. They are like a pyramid. I am engaging with the Reticulum protocol outside of the university that has nothing to do with the university work, because you don't need the infrastructure of the university in order to work with this protocol. So your starting point was that the technology actually works, but it doesn't work for the people. I would flip that and I would say the technology is actually quite a piece of shit at the moment. It doesn't really work, but that makes it very fun for the people to play with it.
Great.
So if people want to play with the Reticulum protocol, they have to search on radar.squad.net, because this is not on social media, and they can find where the community comes together.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maxigas, Rayén and Jo, for joining us here, and let's celebrate mesh networks. Thank you so much. And